Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti, Chris Bergen, and our special guest. Massimo Pigliucci is an author, blogger, podcaster, as well as the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. His academic work is evolutionary biology, philosophy of science, the nature of pseudoscience, and practical philosophy. His books include How to be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, and Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk. His new book is The Quest for Character, What the Story of Socrates and Alcibiades teaches us about our search for good leaders. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you wrote a book that caught our attention. It's called Nonsense on Stilts.
Yeah, that's right there.
How do people do this? How do they fall down this pseudoscience rabbit hole?
Oh, that's a good question. And in fact, it's a question that has been asked for at least 2 millennia. I mean, the first book that we know of about what we today call pseudoscience was written by Cicero, ancient Roman philosopher, and it was entitled On Divination. And it's the first book where he criticizes practices such as astrology and trying to predict the future and stuff like that. It's a good question. There's a lot of research has been done over the last 10 or 20 years about what exactly it is about people's psychology that leads them to believe, things for which there is no particular reason to believe. And it's complicated, but a large part of it has to do with distrust of authority and personal identity. If you pick the typical examples of pseudoscience, let's say creationism, for instance, right? Who professes to be a creationist? These are people who are invested at a very deep core level in their beliefs in a particular brand of Christianity, and they think that the modern theory of evolution threatens that belief. So it isn't about facts, it's about the core identity of these people. Or think about people who for instance, deny the efficacy of vaccines and make fun of scientists and talk about big pharma wanting to make money and nothing else, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's the issue there? There, the issue is trust, lack of trust specifically in official authorities, government, scientists, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a number of other reasons, of course, at both the individual and the social level, why people believe weird stuff. But those are two big ones. And that is what makes it really not an issue of simple debunking, right? I cannot go to a creationist and debunk their notion of the world. I cannot go to a vaccine denialist and debunk their notion of the world, because that's not what it is about. It's about identity and trust. And so it's a question of how do we convince people that their identity doesn't actually depend on, the latest findings in science, or how do we convince people that science as a whole is actually a trustworthy enterprise? Those are the real issues.
We've had nuclear advocates. We have a lot of training in how to understand, misinformation and pseudoscience. And so we have to be very careful, not only in what we advocate for, but also careful in how we address people's criticisms. So when we're talking about trust and distrust, is it easy to sort of find a new bad guy and just point, there's the new bad guy. We can both fear them. And is that an effective way of building bridges to earn someone's trust?
That's a good question. There too, there is a fairly large literature on trust and how you gain it or you lose it. Yeah, of course, fear is certainly a motivating factor in people. I would not, however, try to exploit fear, because fear tends to generate irrational responses. People react on the basis of a fight or flight response, not on the basis of reason. And what we want ideally is to bring back the discourse to reason, evidence. Let's talk about this. These are, after all, complex issues. Most of the issues we're talking about are fairly complex. And so they do require attention, and they require people to just come around a table and sort of start discussing. So I wouldn't use that particular approach. How do you gain trust, trust is a thing that depends on a number of factors. But of course, the major one is you have to have a track record, trustworthy track record, and it has to be long. And you have to be, in other words, trust builds over time. And you have to be very careful because a single bad action or bad word can undermine a lot of effort when it comes to building trust. Right, so imagine let's take a completely pedestrian example. You're in your relationship with your partner, your wife, whoever that is, and for 20 years you never had an extramarital affair. You just had one, very short, for one day. Well, that's going to undo the 20 years of good behavior right on the spot, right? And that's going to take you, if you're going to be able to gain back the trust of your partner, it's going to take years, and it's going to take a lot of effort. So that's one of the reasons why I'm very concerned about scientists or science popularizers who go on television or newspapers or social media and say things that are actually not well supported by the evidence. They just start speculating wildly and things like that, because that undermines trust. Because somebody, we live in a place where every time you go on YouTube, that's going to be recorded. So somebody 5 years down the road is going to show it right back to you. But 5 years ago, you said this, and look at what happened. So you really need to be careful about what you say, how you say it, and probably most of the times you just shouldn't say it.
I really love your example. We have our own bone to pick with several science communicators. And I'll just go ahead and name Michio Kaku has in the past been very, very speculative about a number of world events, including that Fukushima Daiichi disaster. And so this is one of those instances where we as advocates have to come back and try and do a lot in order to undo the damage of some misplaced speculation. And so it's difficult to go up against someone who has a big media presence.
Yep.
What do you think the role in popularizing this sort of, is it a skeptical philosophy or a science philosophy? And what's the role of popularizing it in undoing the damage of these populist speculators?
Well, skepticism, unfortunately, it has a bad reputation, right? So if you look up even just in the dictionary, skeptic usually is described, a skeptic is described as somebody who's a cynic and who always says no and who doesn't believe anything, that sort of stuff, which is really too bad, because the word skeptic comes from the Greek skepsos, which means inquirer. A skeptic is somebody who actually inquires into things, somebody who is open-minded, somebody who listens to the evidence, looks at how things are as much as possible, and is very careful about drawing conclusions. So in a sense, we should all be skeptical of pretty much anything. Unfortunately, the word has been abused so that you have, so-called climate skeptics, for instance, or vaccine skeptics, which are not skeptics at all. These are denialists. But what you call people and what you label people, of course, depends on where you're coming from and what your ideological position or background is. In terms of scientists and talking to the public, so it's a really difficult situation, because on the one hand, you do want scientists to engage with the public. It's, first of all, a lot of scientific research is funded by the public, either directly or indirectly. And, certainly if you're at a university, usually scientists and universities are funded by things like the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, that sort of stuff. So it makes perfect sense to therefore ask, or in fact, I would say even require, those scientists to at least from time to time talk to the public and explain why the hell, what are they doing, and why the hell is it worth funding it. So that makes sense to me. The problem is that most scientists are simply not trained to talk to the public. It's just not part of your training as a scientist. You're never taught rhetoric. You're never taught, how to talk to people or how to persuade people. And it gets worse. A lot of scientists that I know, I will not name names, but a lot of scientists that I know are convinced that just because they have science on their side, or just because they have facts on their side, they're just going to go out there, tell the facts, and of course people are going to accept it. It's like, really, what world do you live in? I mean, have you not been paying attention? People don't respond just to facts. In fact, the first one that pointed out that facts are necessary but not sufficient to persuade people was Aristotle. He wrote a book on rhetoric, and rhetoric is another one of those words that unfortunately has become bad in modern parlance, right? If you engage in rhetoric, it means you want to take advantage of people and pull one over them and that sort of stuff. But rhetoric really is the art of persuasion. And if we're talking about people, then you need to persuade them. And the facts by themselves are not enough to persuade people. So Aristotle thought that there are actually three components, three things you need to do in order to begin to persuade people. One is you have to get what you call is the logos right. The logos is your arguments and your facts. And so my colleagues in the science departments are right. You do have to have your arguments and your facts, because if you don't have those, then you really shouldn't even be talking about whatever the subject is. But Aristotle pointed out immediately that those are not sufficient in themselves. You need two other components. You need an ethos. Ethos comes from the Greek word for character, and it means that you have to establish your credibility. Now, your credibility, a lot of my colleagues seem to think that their credibility is established just by the fact that they're scientists, or just by the fact that they work in a university, or just by the fact that they have a PhD after their names. None of that is enough. A lot of people, unfortunately, in this country are not impressed. In fact, they kind of react negatively to those kind of credentials. So to establish your credentials, your credibility toward people, you have to do something else. You have to show that you are a trustworthy person. You have to interact with those people in a way that is inviting, in the way in which a friend would interact with them, or somebody who has their welfare at core. So that sort of stuff. So that's number two. And then number three is the one that my colleagues really don't want to hear, and that's pathos. Pathos means emotion. And that means, according to Aristotle, that what you need to do is to connect emotionally with other people. If you don't explain to them why the hell they should care about what you're talking about, they're just not going to be interested, or they're not going to move from their initial position. But as soon as you talk about, engaging people at an emotional level, then people start thinking about, oh, you want to manipulate them. You want to somehow doing it's something. It's a dirty word, but persuasion is in a sense manipulation. I mean, however you want to put it, if you want to persuade people, you want to change their mind about something. You don't want to do it in a sneaky way. You don't want to do it in a fake way. But nevertheless, what your goal is to try to change people's mind. And if you don't do all three of those things, get your facts and arguments straight, be convincing of the notion that you're trustworthy, so build your reputation, build your trustworthiness with your audience, and engage them at a emotional level, you're not going anywhere. And scientists are simply not trained, at least in the last two of these three. I would argue even in part in the first one, meaning they do get the facts straight, but usually they don't actually have any training in presenting those facts.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So one of the stated goals of your books is to help the reader solve this demarcation problem. How does that relate to what we've been discussing? And how do you help break down the difference between science, non-science, and pseudoscience? How do you help someone do that?
Yeah, the demarcation problem, that phrase refers to the separation, the distinction between science and pseudoscience. That phrase was actually invented by Karl Popper, who was at the beginning of the 20th century. Popper was a major and influential philosopher of science, and he was interested in the nature of science and the distinction between science and pseudoscience. And he thought he had a very clear and simple distinction that could separate once and for all science from pseudoscience. And that's his famous concept of falsifiability. He thought that if a statement or hypothesis or theory is not falsifiable, meaning that there is no way, even in principle, to show that it is wrong if it is wrong, then it's not scientific. The hallmark, according to Popper, of scientific theories or scientific hypotheses is the fact that there has to be a way to falsify them. That is, there has to be a way to test them empirically and to show that they're false if, in fact, it turns out that they're false. Great. It's fabulous, except that it's not true. there is a lot of pseudoscience that makes perfectly falsifiable statements. For instance, I mentioned creationism earlier on. Creationists typically put forth something called flood geology. Flood geology is the idea that major events in the history of the Earth, such as the formation of the Grand Canyon, happened not over millions of years, but in a matter of days or weeks, right, as a result of floods. And that is falsifiable. That notion is falsifiable. You can actually go and measure the ages of those rocks, and you can estimate the age of the Grand Canyon, and you can falsify that notion. In fact, sure enough, it's false. It turns out to be false. The Grand Canyon is millions of years old. The same goes for things like more standard examples of pseudoscience, like astrology. This has been done. People have done research in which they have asked top astrologists to come up with the astrological charts and personality profiles of a bunch of people on the basis of information related to their birth date and time and stuff like that. And the experiments show that astrologists get the results just about as you would expect by chance. That is, if you divide the sample of people in 12 different categories according to the 12 astrological signs, the chances of getting it right is 1 out of 12. So, in other words, they really don't know anything. So the notion has been falsified. So plenty of pseudoscience is in fact falsifiable, contrary to what Popper was thinking. And it gets worse. Turns out that some legitimate science is not falsifiable, at least not at the moment. For instance, in fundamental physics over the last 30 or 40 years, the dominant theory to explain this sort of fundamental structure of the universe has been string theory, which says that the fundamental constituents of the universe are not particles, but they're these vibrating strings, which then, depending on the frequency at which they vibrate, they behave like the different kinds of particles. Great. It's a nice idea, completely unfalsifiable. No experiment can actually test string theory, at least at the moment and for the foreseeable future. And yet, no scientist thinks that string theory is pseudoscience. They may think that it's speculative science. They may think that at this point it has run its course, and the physicists need to look for alternatives because they're not getting anywhere. So in other words, it's not a productive theory within science, and then possibly at some point it will be abandoned. But it's definitely not falsifiable, and yet it's definitely not pseudoscience. So the issue of demarcation is much more complicated than Popper actually thought. And the current state of the demarcation issue, as far as I can tell, is more or less the following. Philosophers of science agree that there is a continuum between science and pseudoscience. There are, at one extreme, very clear example of pseudoscience that no scientist and no philosopher has doubts about, like astrology, like creationism, like things like that. Those are clearly pseudoscience. Then at the opposite extreme, there are examples of theories or fields of inquiry that are very clearly scientific, and nobody has doubt about that. Fundamental physics, evolutionary biology, atmospheric physics, all of that sort of chemistry, all those things are clearly there. But then things become interesting when you go in the middle. So for instance, certain kinds of research on paranormal phenomena are borderline. I'm personally skeptical of reports of telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, and things like that. But people have been doing, legitimate psychologists have been doing research for a long time about these things. And frankly, the jury is somewhat still out there. Those fields are certainly not in the same category as astrology. Or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which most scientists do consider science. Well, maybe it is, because it's done by astronomers and it's done using radio telescopes and stuff like that, and it costs millions of dollars. But the fact is, it started in the 1950s, and we got exactly 0 data points. This is a very strange science with no data at all. Nothing. Now, of course, this could change tomorrow, right? We could wake up tomorrow morning and look at the New York Times. This is aliens discovered the first contact with ET made, and in which case, great. But so far, it hasn't produced anything, and moreover, it doesn't really have a lot of substance in terms of theory. There is really no theory behind the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, there is something called the Drake equation, which was proposed by Frank Drake, one of the initiators of the whole project, back in the 1950s. And that right there tells you that something is wrong. This is the most advanced theory in the SETI research program is 70 plus years old. No scientific theory is that old that hasn't been modified since. So there is issues. Now, is it a pseudoscience? Absolutely not. But it's not quite in the same category as chemistry or physics or biology, etc.
Right. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
About a decade ago, there was a book written by Richard Rhodes called Energy. Richard Rhodes is a Pulitzer winner for previous works he had done. But in that, he says that for new technologies to be accepted and understood for the most part, it takes about 80 years, a full lifetime. Do you find that to be true also with schools of thought and philosophies, or is there just not a new thought under the sun, so to speak?
No, I actually find that to be not true, even in the case of technology. The iPhone came out in 2007. I adopted it a month later, and I understood pretty well what I was doing. So I think that's actually a lot of nonsense, quite frankly. Now, there are examples of course, of technologies whose impact is not completely clear until years after they've been introduced. And there certainly are ideas in science that are introduced and they don't go anywhere for a long time. But that's by far not a generalization. I mean, you can come up easily with examples both ways. For instance, the theory of continental drift in geology, it did take decades before it was accepted. But that's not because geologists were sort of closed-minded and didn't want to open to the new reality and so on and so forth. It's because there was no actual empirical mechanism that could produce the movement of continents on Earth. And scientists tend to be conservative from that perspective, not politically conservative. They tend to be conservative in the sense that they're not going to jump on a new idea until they have actually very good reasons to think that it is acceptable. So it took decades for people to figure out how actual continents could actually move on the surface of the Earth. Once that they figured it out, that the theory was immediately accepted. But on the other hand, take the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin co-published a paper with Alfred Wallace announcing to the world the discovery of natural selection in 1858. 2 months later, everybody that knew anything about it was on board. Yes, there were, of course, resistance. There was resistance. There were creationists. There were scientists who did not accept the idea. But it spread immediately, very, very quickly, very, very fast. So it depends. I don't think you can make that kind of generalization in any field. Sometimes ideas encounter resistance for a number of reasons, either because they're interesting ideas, but there is not enough empirical evidence or not enough good reasons at the moment to accept them, or sometimes for ideological reasons. Quantum mechanics was accepted immediately by almost everybody except by Einstein, which is ironic because he was one of the co-discoverers, exactly what brought about the quantum mechanical revolution. But he famously said, God doesn't play dice because he was bothered by this fundamental randomness at the core of quantum mechanics. And as long as he lived, he had issues with that. He always thought that there was something missing that eventually people will figure out. And now we know that he was wrong. I mean, and for crying out loud, if Einstein can be wrong, then surely the rest of us can as well.
Yeah. I will point out that about 80 years ago or so, 90 years ago, Dick Tracy comic books had a two-way radio television on his wristwatch. So the idea of the iPhone was there.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm a fan of science fiction, and I hear that a lot about science fiction. Like, oh, such and such author foresaw the invention of this or that or the other. I think that's a little too easy. What science fiction writers often, not always, but often come up with is with the perception of a need, which is completely different and separate from the actual discovery or invention of something. Like for instance, the communicators in Star Trek, right? I've heard William Shatner telling this interesting story, funny story once. So remember when the flip phones, before smartphones, there were flip phones, right? And he was invited by, I forgot what the company was, to the presentation of one of these first flip phones when they came out. And they gave him one as a present. So he goes to the airport to go back home, and he flips out the phone, and people start pointing at him because, of course, here is Captain Kirk that opens up the communicator, right? Now, does that mean that Gene Roddenberry or whoever came up with the idea of Star Trek communicators anticipated the cell phones? Well, yes and no, right? He clearly anticipated the need for it. He anticipated that at some point, if technologically feasible, somebody will figure out a way to do that sort of stuff. But of course, he didn't give us any specific technical specifics on how to actually do it. It's not like you can say, well, Gene Roddenberry invented the cell phones. He did not, obviously. So that goes for a lot of things that science fiction authors are often said to have invented. And of course, there's just as long a list of things that they invented and never actually came to fruition, like time machines, for instance.
Yes, or nuclear submarines.
Nuclear submarines, sure. Yeah, as I said, you can go on and on with the examples. Yes. This is something that actually Carl Sagan pointed out in a different context. He was talking about aliens. You know what? Like all these aliens that allegedly talk to people that they kidnap and and tell them something. And Sagan pointed out that all these aliens travel all this way to Earth to just give us really vanilla style warnings about the end of the world, don't make war, that sort of stuff. It's like, that's not impressive. Now, if an alien came up and told, gave the blueprints, for instance, for a completely different, novel kind of technology that we have no idea otherwise how to build, now that would be impressive. That would be something to pay attention to. But, the vanilla thing,
Going back to falsifiability, let me see if I could get this straight. It's if you could test it and verify it through testing, then it's science. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly. Because although Popper was wrong, I think, as I explained about falsifiability, he was right about criticizing verifiability as a criterion. So yeah, a lot of people, including scientists, have this idea that, well, if I have a theory and then the experiment verifies the prediction of the theory, then we're good, right? I mean, what else do you want? The problem is it's too easy to verify things because there is lots of claims that a particular scientific theory makes. And a lot of these claims are kind of the vanilla variety claims. They're not really out there. They don't present a strong test for the theory. Falsifiable claims, on the other hand, do. For instance, let me give you an example, and hopefully that will make things clear. Popper was rightly so influenced and impressed by something that happened in, I believe it was 1919. There was a total eclipse of the sun, and astronomers went out there to measure certain very specific predictions that were made by Einstein's theory of general relativity, which had been published only 40 years earlier, 1915. And particularly, one of these predictions was that large gravitational masses, such as the mass of the sun, would slightly bend light. So that if you observe an eclipse and you look at the stars that are coming in and out from behind the solar disk, you can predict exactly when they should come out. But if the light is bent, then that moment is going to be either earlier or later, just by a fraction of a second, or it's very, very short amount of time. Now that is a very, very specific prediction. To put it as Popper did, is like that means that the theory really sticking out its neck on the chopping block, because that prediction is so specific and it's so novel that if it fails, it really does falsify the theory. It really does us now that this thing is not going to happen. Well, what if the prediction is verified, which it was at the time? In 1919, astronomers did take the pictures, took the measurements, did the calculations, and it turned out that the predictions of the general theory of relativity were in fact verified. Should we then conclude that the theory is true? And Popper said, no. We should conclude that the theory has not been falsified yet. That is, his notion is that science doesn't make progress by verifying one idea after another. It makes progress by eliminating bad ideas or bad theories one after another. Now, move forward, more than a century, because we're now already a century after the 1919 eclipse. What happened to the general theory of relativity? Well, it has survived hundreds of tests of the same kind, very specific predictions that have been confirmed, including some in which Einstein himself didn't believe. One of the predictions of the general theory of relativity is that there should be things called black holes, collapsed stars that have force that not even light escapes from it. Einstein didn't believe in black holes. He thought that this is a weird thing that comes out of the theory, but there must be something wrong. And yet black holes, in fact, have been discovered. So we now know the existence of a number of black holes. So the theory has been confirmed, verified many, many times over. And yet we know that it must be wrong. We know that it must be wrong at some level because in some areas, the general theory of relativity makes predictions that are at odds with the predictions made by the other dominant theory in physics, quantum mechanics. And if you have two theories that make different predictions about the same thing, such as, for instance, the physics of black holes, just to use the same example, then at least one of them must be wrong, possibly both. And that is why, in fact, physicists have been searching for a new fundamental theory, such as string theory, which I mentioned earlier, because they already know that either quantum mechanics or general relativity, possibly both, are actually incomplete or incorrect. So that's the nature of scientific theories and the nature of science itself. We don't speak of truth verification. We speak of that theory is being useful as a model for understanding things up to now. And it will remain useful until it fails somehow or until a better model comes up and does a better job.
Okay.
Very nice. Well, we kind of have some of those models in the nuclear advocacy realm. We have this old idea of linear no threshold model for radiation exposure. So this is the idea that incrementally we build up radiation exposure and it has a linear effect. And when I speak with health physicists about this problem, they point out that it will take billions, if not trillions, of observations to prove this true or false. And we constantly are getting more news about additional theories, additional observations, additional critiques of the original science.
Well, I cannot comment specifically on the theory you're talking about because I know nothing about it. And I am trying to make a habit not to talk about things that I don't know anything about. However, the general principle is that there is no sharp demarcation between, as we were saying earlier, between an actual pseudoscience and something that is borderline and it might be, in fact, legitimate science. It's a question of we have to use our judgment. So string theory, for instance, again, going back to the same example. Well, when it was proposed in the 1980s, it looked like the next big thing. It looked like, oh, wow, people have gotten this really interesting idea. Let's work on it. And an entire generation, actually, at this point, 2 generations of physicists have worked on it, in fact, and they've refined it, that there are now different versions of the theory. There's all sorts of, a lot of stuff out there. There's a large literature on it. And so far, people still refer to it as science. However, because it has not generated any new empirical findings, it has not been possible to test any aspect of the theory empirically, people have started having doubts, not really about the truth of the theory, because as I said, scientists usually don't really talk about truth. They only talk about, well, is the model useful or not? These scientific theories are models of aspects of the universe. And the question is it useful or is it not? And if a model has not been particularly useful, meaning that it's not been productive, it has not generated new data, it has not generated new findings for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, now going 50 years, at some point people would say, you know what, maybe it's pseudoscience, maybe it's not, maybe it's good, but it's not going anywhere. And therefore we're going to set it aside and trying to do something different, which is in fact what is happening to some extent in fundamental physics. Now there is a lot more talk about alternatives to string theory, precisely because an increasing number of physicists are dissatisfied with it. It's like, okay, well, this is an interesting idea, but it's not getting anywhere. And therefore, what are we going to do here? If science doesn't produce new findings, new insights into the world, then it's not doing its job.
this sort of leads into our next question. There's the idea that we must look beyond the modern era in many ways. And is this idea of postmodernism, that modern society will be eclipsed by something in the future, or other interpretations of the idea of postmodernism, is this affecting our perception of science?
It's hard to say because the word postmodernism has so many different meanings depending on who you're talking to. You know, postmodernism actually started out as a movement in literature and in art criticism, which has nothing to do with either philosophy of science or science. And then eventually spilled over in science, particularly in epistemology, the philosophical study of the nature of claims to truth or claims to knowledge, right? So these days, if you are a postmodernist, what that means is that you do not take at face value the pronouncements of any authority, including scientific authorities, because you always realize that any kind of human enterprise is inevitably affected by relations of powers and by interests that are external to the alleged objective of that enterprise. So for instance, in the case of science, I can tell you, having been a scientist for a good number of decades in the field of biology, I can tell you that of course there are interests. There are private interests. You have pharmaceutical industries, for instance, you have chemical industries, you have all sorts of engineering, et cetera, et cetera. Those are legitimate interests, but they also have financial interests, and financial interests therefore affect what people do and why people do it. I can tell you that there are power relations. I mean, there are people who are more or less influential than others within the sciences at all sorts of levels, within a department, within a university, or within that university at large, or at the level of funding organizations, etc. I can tell you because I've seen it with my own eyes, and because there is plenty of empirical evidence at this point. There's also patterns of discrimination, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. None of this should be surprising because science is a human enterprise. It's done by human beings, not by robots. And therefore, it's obvious that the people respond not just to what they're supposed to be responding, the search for knowledge and truth and all that sort of stuff, but they also respond to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and power, the usual stuff that human beings always respond to. I think that if one takes postmodernism to mean, look, you need to be careful because any human enterprise is affected by those extraneous factors. And therefore, you need to be careful about evaluating the output, the results of that enterprise, because it may not be what it looks like. I think that in that sense, postmodernism is simply an application of critical thinking. Yeah, no kidding. It's something, science is done by human beings, so you need to be careful. Unfortunately, sometimes, perhaps often, postmodernism is interpreted as to be a complete rejection of science. And for some postmodernist authors, it probably was. There were some people really out there, and during the peak time of postmodernism, which was in the late 80s to the 90s to the early 2000s. And those would be people who would say, no, science is just as bad as pseudoscience. It's astrologists on one hand, astronomers on the other hand. It's all human beings. They're all making up stuff as they go. Well, that's clearly nonsense. That just doesn't work. So it depends on what we mean by the word. I think that, unfortunately, at this point, the word postmodern is being overused and corrupted to a point that it's essentially useless. But if we're talking about the notion that we should be careful of scientific institutions because they are human institutions, and therefore they're liable to the usual weaknesses and problems, structural problems of all human institutions, I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. What is not valid is to throw them out. Because you can apply the same thing to everything else. I mean, governments are made by human beings, private corporations are run by human beings, and so on and so on. But that doesn't mean that you want to throw out all governments and all private corporations just because they're run by human beings, because what is the alternative, right? So be careful is one thing. Throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, it's another thing. Now, there are also other ways of looking at a sort of whatever the future that comes out after the modern. For instance, there is a somewhat strange movement called transhumanism, where people are thinking about what it will mean to be a human in a post-human world, in a place where either we become deeply intertwined with artificial intelligence, or we develop sufficient knowledge to modify our own genome and therefore take charge of our own evolution. Those are all interesting and speculative ideas at this point. I am very careful about going in those directions, because I don't think that human beings have the wisdom that it takes to do that kind of stuff. So it's difficult enough to be a human. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to be a post-human.
Before hitting on post-humanism, we talked a little bit about just the flat rejection of science, and it maybe relates to blind adherence, or is that scientism? And how do you define scientism?
Yeah, that's another one of those words that it's abused, and it has different meaning depending on who you're talking to. So scientism, in my mind, is an ideology. It's an ideological approach to science. It's essentially a position that says that the only interesting questions are scientific questions, that the only source of knowledge is science, and so on and so forth. And a lot of scientists do engage in scientism. They seem to think that those things are true, but not all of them. In fact, I'm not sure even if the majority of scientists believes that. In that sense, I think scientism is problematic, because it tends to exclude a lot of other fields of inquiry that we should not exclude, including philosophy, history. It also depends on what you mean by science. By science, you mean only the natural sciences, or are we including psychology, sociology, economics, or are we excluding them? So it depends on how far you want to go. I do agree, however, that said, that science is the only reliable source of knowledge about the nature of the world. I don't think we've come up with anything better than that. Divine revelation doesn't do it. Intuition doesn't do it. Hallucinogenic substances don't do it. None of that stuff works. So if we're talking about how do we know about the nature of the world, the structure of reality, et cetera, well, yeah, the answer there is science. I don't think there is any other answer. But I don't think that's a case of scientism, because I still want to say that there's a distinction between knowledge and understanding, and then there is another distinction between understanding and wisdom. Science doesn't give you necessarily understanding. It does give you knowledge. It gives you a limited understanding. It definitely doesn't give you wisdom. And so it shouldn't be the end of all our efforts from that perspective. That said, and to be fair to my colleagues who are more favorable than I am to the whole issue of scientism, it's also true that the word scientism or scientistic has been used as a word of abuse by purveyors of pseudoscience. So you get a lot of creationists to accuse you, if you're a critic of creation, they accuse you of being a scientist, you're acting scientistically. And that is nonsense, but it is a use that you do find in the literature, in public discourse. So unfortunately, a lot of these words that we've been using, scientism and pseudoscience and so on, they're complicated. It depends on what you mean, and we really need to be clear about the use of the term. Probably we should stay clear of those words, because they tend, at this point, unfortunately, they tend to generate more confusion than anything else. So if you want to say that something is, let's say, somebody's attitude is scientistic, well, tell me exactly what you think he's doing wrong, and then we can talk about the specific matter. If you want to dismiss something, want to be skeptical of something, well, I don't care about the label. Tell me exactly what your problem is and what your position is, and then we'll talk about it.
Great. Well, I understand you have a new book coming out called The Quest for Character. What would you like to tell us about this?
Thank you. It's out already, actually. It's a very different kind of book where I explore the question of character, that is personality, and how it develops and how we can improve it from both the philosophical and historical perspective and the scientific perspective. The reason for that is because character is arguably the most important thing we have. Our character really defines who we are and how we act in the world. And so it's something that we should be paying particular attention to. And the quest part of the book has to do with the fact that for at least the last 2.5 millennia, people, philosophers, and then eventually scientists, or even in fact religious leaders, have been on a quest to improve both their own character and the character of other people. In other words, it's a quest for ethical self-improvement. We want to become better people. And to become a better person just means, in fact, to behave better on a consistent basis. And if you behave better on a consistent basis, it means that you actually have managed to improve your character. So the book starts out with a historical look. It starts out with classic examples of both good and bad character. The very first two individuals we meet in the book are Socrates and Alcibiades. Socrates, I think, needs no introduction. Arguably the most famous philosopher of all time, lived in ancient Athens about the 4th century, 5th century BC. Alcibiades was an interesting character. He was a friend and student of Socrates. He was an incredibly ambitious man, and he really made a mess out of his life. He's one of those examples of the kind of person you really don't want to be. And yet he was so flamboyant and he had such an interesting life that I'm still stunned that nobody's made a movie or a television series based on Alcibiades' life. I mean, just to give you the very basics, right? So the guy at the tender age of 20 manages to convince the Athenian assembly to make him general in charge of the Athenian army during the Peloponnesian War against the Spartans. Alcibiades was uber rich, descending from one of the most important families in Athens, handsome as hell, brave. It was like, in theory, he had everything you wanted in a human being. And yet, he manages to mess up everything. I mean, he convinces the Athenians to open a second front in the Peloponnesian War and to invade Sicily. That was a bad mistake that basically destroyed the Athenian army and most of its navy, and eventually brought an end to the war where the Athenians were defeated by the Spartans. He gets accused of impiety by the Athenians, so he skips and he goes to Sparta. So he switches sides. He doesn't just ask for asylum in Sparta. He actually starts advising the Spartans against the Athenians, very effectively, I should say. Then when he's in Sparta, what does he do? He seduces the Spartan queen and gets her pregnant, which obviously the Spartan king did not appreciate. And so now the Spartans are after Alcibiades, so he has to escape again. What does he do? He goes to the Persians. The Persians were common enemies of both the Spartans and the Athenians. And once again, he doesn't just ask for asylum. He actually starts advising them on how to defeat both the Spartans and the Athenians. I mean, this thing keeps going on and on and on. Eventually, he manages to get himself recalled back to Athens somehow. After all he's done. It's not clear how he manages that. Comes back to Athens, is put back in charge, and starts winning. So Athens all of a sudden sort of overturns the situation in the war, and he starts winning. And then he makes one tiny mistake. He loses a minor battle. The Athenians just kick him out. Finally, he escapes one more time, and the Spartans send a bunch of people after them. They surround him in his house in the mountains, and nobody dares coming into the house because Alcibiades was a very valiant warrior, and nobody wanted to go there to get inside and get in a hand-to-hand combat with him. So they just burn down the place until he comes out, and then they kill him from a distance with arrows and spears. So it's an incredible life. Now, why the hell do I start the book with that person? Because he was a student of Socrates. So you would expect that Socrates, of all people, would have been able to teach a little bit of wisdom and sense into his own students. But in fact, we know from Plato that Socrates did try to teach Alcibiades and very quickly recognized that Alcibiades was unteachable because he was affected by hubris. He was affected by this notion that he was better than anybody else and somehow he would do great things. And so it is Socrates himself who says at one point, my dear Alcibiades, you're really a fool. And if you insist in this course of action, you're going to make a mess of things for both yourself and our city. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So the book starts out with this relationship between these two, and then eventually it gets all the way to modern times and to what science says about character and how to improve it. And it turns out that we have discovered a few things that work to make us better human beings. For instance, one of the things that works is the notion of critical self-analysis. One of the techniques that people use these days, which are evidence-based, is to keep a diary, a journal, basically, of your successes and failures, and write in that journal in a very analytical, that is non-emotional way, about what you did and how you did it and how and what happened and what you learned from that experience and how you're going to be doing better into the future. This creates sort of a ongoing record of your progress, and it turns out empirically it is in fact very useful to keep people doing better, basically acting more ethically over the long term.
This sounds fascinating. Is there any application to this science-based character tools in leadership, either government or corporate or anything else like that you can see that you want to really tease? Why should they buy this book?
Yeah, I think that in fact the major applications are in leadership, especially at government, but also in the private sector. The problem is that we live in a society, perhaps we've always lived in this kind of society, but certainly now we live in a society where we give exactly the wrong incentives to our leaders. We do not select our leaders on the basis of their character and how good they are as human beings or how wise they are as leaders. We give them completely different incentives. We select them on the basis of how flamboyant they are, how outrageous they are, how popular on social media they are, and so on and so forth. I don't think I need to remind you of recent American politics in order to sort of make that point. Mm-hmm. And so in the book, I conclude by saying that we should be doing better in terms of our leaders, again, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And at the end of the day, at least in a democracy, or somewhat of a democracy as the United States is, at the end of the day, the fault is ours. I mean, the buck stops with us because we are the ones that elect these people. I mean, it's easy to blame the politician for what they are or what they're not. But at the end of the day, well, if you knew that that's that kind of person, why did you vote for him? And so at the end of the day, it really is on us to decide that character and wisdom really are important, and that is the kind of people we want to lead us. I was struck, if you remember, just even years ago when George Bush went up against Al Gore. People were talking about things like, well, Al Gore is a smart guy. He seems to know what he's talking about. But I feel more comfortable having a beer with George Bush. And it's like, how does that matter? I mean, is that the job of the president of the United States, to have a beer with you? I don't think so. So long as people have that kind of priority, then I'm sorry, but we get the leaders that we deserve.
Chris.
Yeah, just kind of building on what you just said, I've noticed the last few years we're in a society of bread and circuses in a way.
Yes.
During COVID, I was disappointed that all these people stuck at home didn't watch one documentary a week or read one book a month for self-help or history thing, and everyone was all into new things. The idea of the YouTube reactor has come along. They're reacting to things in their generation or their parents' generation of TV that isn't necessarily educational and learning. And there's very few that are doing educational type things that I understand people need to blow off steam. People need to have fun, but at the same time, sometimes learning and seeing the connections you can make in your personal life or the lives around you from things you learn can be equally exciting.
Right. I think that the pandemic especially showed us very clearly what people's choices are. There's been for years now an interesting discussion within the field of economics. The economics is now divided into sort of classical economics and behavioral economics. And classical economists make certain assumptions about the behavior of human beings. They think that, okay, let's simplify things. Let's imagine that human beings are perfect rational agents. They make choices on the basis of information, et cetera, et cetera. And then behavioral economists come in and says, no, let's do research on actual human beings. And now they really make their choices. And one of the fundamental principles of behavioral economics is that you don't ask people what they do or what they want to do. You track what they actually do, how they actually spend their money. So I'm pretty sure that if you had asked people at the beginning of the pandemic, so you're going to have 3 months on your own at home, your family, what are you going to do? The responses would probably be, oh, I'm going to watch a lot of documentaries. I'm going to read a lot of books. I'm going to do also, I'm going to listen to opera. I'm going to learn a new language, that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's very interesting. But what did people actually do as during doing that period? Not exactly the same thing. And that is, in a sense, the tragedy of technologies such as the internet or social media, right? In principle, these are technologies that have the potential to change the world for the better. The internet has made available all sorts of interesting and fascinating information about all sorts of topics, and yet the major use of the internet is porn. I mean, that's a fact. Social media have the potential to connect you not only with your relatives and friends across the world, which is great, but also to potentially connect you with teachers, with people who are trying to make a difference in the world, with activists, with all sorts of stuff. And occasionally that does happen, but in fact, most of the times people go to YouTube or TikTok and they listen to so-called influencers, most of whom don't know absolutely a crap about what they're talking about, and some of them of whom are teenager or even pre-teenage kids. And they make millions out of the fact that people just go there, flock to their channels, instead of going places where they might actually learn something. So, what are you going to do? It's a general lack of education. I don't mean education here only specifically in the academic sense of the term. I mean education broadly, as in understanding of the world, which generates wisdom. Plato, another student of Socrates, very different from Alcibiades, famously said that the root of all evil is ignorance. And I think he had a point. And again, he didn't mean people not going to college. He meant ignorance in the sense of willful ignorance, in the sense of, I rather listen to the teenage influencer than the accomplished journalist on BBC or something like that, or whatever comparison you want to make. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is Massimo Pigliucci. His latest book is The Quest for Character. I'm Carl, joined here by Gabe and Chris. This is the Ecomodernist channel live. You can find us on Twitch at Soyaddle. You can find us on YouTube at Ecomodernist1 or the Ecomodernist channel. And you can find us on Facebook at the Ecomodernist Society of North America. We'll be here every Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific and every Wednesday at, let's see, Gabe, what's the Wednesday show?
It's 8 o'clock Eastern Time, 4 o'clock Pacific.
Yeah, and thanks for keeping that up as well. So thank you, everyone, for your contribution. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.